Welcome to Unit 7, and in Unit 7 we're continuing our art historical tour where for this art historical unit, I'm covering from the late Baroque through the Rococo, all the way up to the art of the Enlightenment. And it's kind of a long story and got a lot of parts, and definitely this is probably the part of art history that's often the most sort of eye-glazing for many students. The artwork for many, I think, might start to look a little bit the same, but I think if you break it apart into groups of people and into periods of time, then it's a little bit easier to understand. And I think it's an important kind of transition to understand because there are a lot of sort of dichotomies that are set in this period. The dichotomy between well, one of the major dichotomies is between art being sort of an international style versus art being kind of local movements and the different ways that those kind of things interact. Another dichotomy that is kind of established is the sort of dichotomy between painters who are aiming for really loose and gestural and mostly transparent type painting, where the paint is transparent and the mark making is therefore kind of showable and transparent, versus painters who are aiming for a much more sort of hard-edged and flat type surface. And we also have the dichotomy of just the dichotomy between those who feel like art needs to be about extremely serious issues, about the big weighty topics of its time, versus those who feel like art is about pleasure and might even be slightly frivolous. And so these kind of dichotomies become really important in this period, but we see them continuing through the Romantic period, and we see them continuing into the modernist period. So this this particular period of art really, in some ways, kind of sets a lot of our modern world, although it may not look it just looking at the artwork. So we start this story by talking about two Dutch artists, right? The Baroque, where we left off, we were talking about Velázquez and Rubens, both artists who really at the height of their career in the 1630s, 1640s, and 1650s. Um, and here I want to talk about two Dutch artists and two very different kinds of careers and two very different artists, but who um, kind of represent some of the different possibilities of what was going on in Baroque painting, and also they represent this more and more important sort of local quality to Baroque painting, where the local tastes and local traditions become more important. So let's start with Vermeer, who was known mostly for smaller, modest-sized paintings, and mostly did kind of genre scene paintings. Genre painting will become a part of the tradition of painting that'll become very important. It's just starting to become important in this period, and the idea of a genre is basically where the painter is making sort of a slice of life image, right? Where they're kind of capturing a moment where people are sort of in everyday clothes. Although in Vermeer's paintings, they were often in a slightly idealized and stylized version of everyday clothes. And many of Vermeer's genre paintings also appear to be allegories. Like, this isn't just simply a woman just happening to read a letter. It's not like a snapshot. It is a careful compositional study, and it seems to be about things. Oftentimes, there's a lot of clues in the maps and the tapestries on the walls in Vermeer paintings. And in some of his paintings, they're outright, very elaborate metaphors, like the allegory of painting. Um, and he had a very kind of individual style of working, a very kind of a very flat and crisp kind of hand, mostly a pretty sharp edge, but also a very photographic way of thinking about shape and about decisions of value and color. And we're pretty sure that they are very photographic. I mean, a good example of that will be if you look at like this shape of that highlight, or even the shape of that highlight on the nose right there. or like the way these shapes are organized. That's a very photographic way of seeing. And we think that that demonstrates the fact that he was using a camera obscura, which is a type of camera, but not a camera that makes a print, has film in it. It's just simply a means of projecting an image on a wall, and then he uses that projection as a source for his painting. And we're pretty sure that Vermeer worked that way. Vermeer made most, just to say, Vermeer made most of his money in his life as an art dealer, and was not very well known as a painter himself. But now we, we admire him as one of the great painters of all time. And I think also, I think to a certain degree, he maybe was not admired in his own time, in part because of his particular way of thinking about composition. It's a very grid-oriented composition, very modernist in approach. And I think it really kind of took the 20th century where other artists were organizing compositions in, like someone like Mondrian, right? Organizing compositions in very kind of flat, grid-like systems for this kind of order, this kind of arrangement to feel believable and also to feel aesthetic, right? Rembrandt was a very different artist. He was one point in his career very successful and almost, could have had a career that his goal was to have a career more like Rubens, where he was painting big, ambitious paintings, but that never quite panned out for him, and that may have said more about the Dutch market for paintings than it said anything about Rembrandt's abilities. Rembrandt was an amazing artist, but but even though he was at some points in his career extremely successful, in the end he was pretty much destitute and was, not well remembered. But fortunately, the paintings are saved for us, and now we can really see what a genius Rembrandt was. He, if for no other reason, just his self-portraits. He did self-portraits for his entire life, and we have sometimes multiple paintings per a year. And so we have so many self-portraits, and it's such an amazing psychological study of who he was and how his life was changing. And also, Rembrandt was extremely important as a printmaker, and he made a lot of his money in printmaking. So, and when we talk about printmaking, we'll talk a little bit more about it. But one of the things that's truly amazing about Rembrandt was the incredibly sophisticated but also consistent way that he was able to over and under ink a plate. Generally, printmakers aim for inking plates in an extremely even and consistent manner, because if you try to under ink sections and over ink sections, it's very hard to stay consistent and then have a consistent edition. But he did it very well and really turned etchings almost into a very painterly type medium. All right, so that's the last of the Rembrandt paintings we're going to be looking at. So that's Holland, but at the same time, in this later period, we start to see Rubens' influence spread, and most notably through his assistant and pupil, Anthony Van Dyke, who then went on mostly to work in England and became like the most famous painter living in England. That's my 1 minute warning. So, I think Van Dyke really kind of set the aesthetics for England. So when we get to the English painters at the end of this lecture, you'll kind of see that influence. All right, we're going to end there. When we talk next, we'll talk about Andrea Pozzo.